Denzel Washington walked into a shopping mall with firm steps, wearing only a threadbare jacket, sunglasses, and his hands in his pockets. Hardly anyone paid any attention to him. In the corner of the main lobby, a security guard frowned, looking Denzel up and down suspiciously. "Hey, buddy," said the security guard, his voice laced with disdain. "I think you'd better look elsewhere. This isn't for everyone." Denzel remained silent. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He just watched as men and women in expensive clothes received smiles and good treatment from the staff, while other people in simpler clothes were greeted coldly. This confirmed what he already suspected about the mall. He took a step back, turned slowly and left, leaving the security guard behind, who crossed his arms in satisfaction as he watched the intruder walk away. But the next day, that same security guard would discover that he had made the biggest mistake of his life, and would learn, in the most painful way possible, that not everyone who wears discreet clothes is as insignificant as he imagined. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified whenever there are new stories on the channel. Denzel Washington was walking through the streets of the Edgewood neighborhood on the outskirts of Philadelphia, observing the intense movement of the late afternoon. Although it was an area known for its sophisticated stores, bright windows, and well-dressed people, the cold November wind meant that many people were shrinking into heavy coats. Denzel, however, wore a simple jacket and faded jeans, a short-brimmed hat pulled down as if to avoid being recognized. He headed straight for the Brightwood Galleria, a luxury shopping center that opened just over 2 years ago. From the outside, the building was impressive, rising through several floors of sparkling glass. In advertisements around the city, it advertised itself as Philadelphia's new landmark of exclusive consumption. The promise was to offer not only high-end products, but also special treatment for its customers. However, Denzel had received complaints that this special treatment often translated into explicit discrimination against those who did not appear to have high purchasing power. That day, as he walked through the gleaming doors of the Brightwood Galleria, the first thing Denzel noticed was the subtle scent of expensive perfumes mixed with the sound of soft ambient music. The floor, made of light marble, reflected the white lights from the ceiling, giving the place an almost ethereal atmosphere. Well-dressed people walked around with designer bags. Those who seemed to have a simpler style of dress were the target of suspicious glances from the staff and security guards. Denzel watched closely as a young couple interacted with the receptionist in the main hall. They were trying to ask for information about an electronics store, but the receptionist just pointed them dryly towards the elevator, without smiling or offering much help. A few minutes later, a man in an impeccably cut suit approached to ask about the same place and received, in return, not only a broad smile, but also a personal escort to the escalator. This confirmed the conversations Denzel had heard. The Galleria really did seem to have double standards when it came to serving different people. As he crossed the main corridor, he felt a hard stare on his back. He turned and saw James Wilkins, one of the security guards, approaching with a rigid posture. Denzel's clothes, a worn-out jacket and jeans, were nowhere near the mall's standard. "Good afternoon, sir," said James, his voice dry. "Do you need anything?" Denzel smiled amiably. "I'm just taking a walk, thanks." James frowned. "This mall is quite exclusive. Sometimes people who aren't, let's say, regular customers, end up feeling uncomfortable here." Denzel straightened his hat, staring at him without losing his temper. "Are you implying that I shouldn't be here?" The security guard huffed. The security guard snorted. "I have nothing against you, but people who come into the Galleria usually know what they want to buy. If you don't need anything, maybe you should go somewhere else." "I see," replied Denzel, with an almost disarming calmness. "But I don't see why I can't visit the mall. Isn't it a public space?" James hesitated for a moment, as if looking for the best way to get him off his back. Then he gave a slightly disdainful smile. "It's private, sir, but no one's going to stop you moving around, as long as you don't make a fuss." Denzel just nodded. "Of course, thank you for the information." He continued on his way, pretending not to care about the hostile reception. He passed in front of some famous clothing stores, observing the contrast between the attention given to elegant-looking customers and the disregard for those wearing modest clothes. In one window, she saw an elderly woman, Evelyn Campbell, trying to get the attention of a sales assistant to ask the price of a coat. The saleswoman, with a faint smile, replied quickly and left to attend to another customer who was showing off a shiny wristwatch. This bothered Denzel deeply. It wasn't the first time he'd seen something like this, but there was something even more brazen in the air. It seemed institutional, as if all the layers of staff at the Galleria had been trained to identify and serve only a specific group of visitors well. He then decided to go into a coffee shop, Morning Light Coffee, to observe the reaction of the staff up close. Ahead of him in the queue was a man in a navy blue suit and shiny shoes, who was greeted with an enthusiastic, "Good afternoon, sir," the usual. The man smiled and exchanged friendly words, while the barista took his order and left the till open, without charging him in advance. Then it was Denzel's turn. "Good afternoon. Can I take your order?" asked the barista, without smiling. "Sure. I'd like a black coffee." The barista typed the order into the computer screen. "That'll be $3, sir." Denzel raised his eyebrows. He noticed that the man in the suit in front of him hadn't been charged immediately. Nevertheless, he took out his wallet and paid without saying anything. He picked up his coffee and looked for an empty table in the corner of the store. There, he observed how other people in plain clothes were also charged immediately, while wealthier-looking customers were treated completely differently. A few minutes later, who appeared at the cafe door? Security guard James Wilkins, of course. He was visibly annoyed by Denzel's presence. This time, he approached the table. "I hope everything's all right here," he said, his hands folded. Behind his back in an authoritative gesture, Denzel looked at him over his cup. "That's fine. Thank you. Just a reminder, we won't accept any kind of disturbance." Denzel took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "Don't worry, I'm not here to cause a fuss, just having my coffee." Wilkins gave him another suspicious look, but backed away, leaving the cafe and standing near the entrance, still keeping an eye on him. With each passing minute, Denzel was more certain that something was very wrong. He would finish his coffee and leave without lingering. But in his mind, he was beginning to devise a plan. That night, in his hotel, Denzel spent hours reading articles, online reviews and testimonials from former Brightwood Galleria employees who reported situations of veiled racism, discrimination based on social class and internal pressures to maintain a premium image at any cost. It brought back bad memories of when he had started his career, long before he became a screen icon. He remembered being underestimated by directors, ignored by producers, and humiliated by those who thought he didn't belong in a certain environment. Denzel knew from his own life experience that prejudice, whatever its motivation, is a sore that silently lodges itself in institutions. So he decided that he would return to the Galleria the next day. But this time, he would make everyone realize who he really was and the consequences of treating him as unwanted. The next day, Denzel returned to the mall at exactly the same time, wearing the same clothes. It didn't take long for James Wilkins to notice him. The security guard closed his eyes as soon as he saw him. "You again. I thought you got the message," James shouted, approaching quickly, almost bumping into Denzel's shoulders. "And I thought this was a place of free access," Denzel retorted firmly. The words almost sparked another argument, but at that moment a man came running up, out of breath. It was Robert Harris, the mall's general security supervisor. He looked at Denzel and immediately recognized his face. He went pale. "Mr. Washington," he stammered, almost in disbelief. "1,000 apologies. I didn't know you were coming today." James stared wide-eyed, not understanding. "Wait, what do you mean, Mr. Washington?" Robert swallowed. "This is Denzel Washington, James. Denzel Washington." The security guard blinked a few times without reaction. Denzel took off his hat, allowing his face to become more visible. A few people passing by were also beginning to notice who he was, but the mall wasn't that crowded at the time, so there was still a certain amount of discretion. James seemed to swallow a lump in his throat. "My God, I had no idea." Without losing his composure, Denzel stared at him. Yes, but you've made it quite clear how you treat those who don't seem to belong, haven't you? The tension in the air was palpable. Robert tried to intervene. Mr. Washington, I can explain. There's been a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding, Denzel cut in a harsher tone than usual. I came yesterday. I saw a lot of things wrong. Prejudice towards customers who don't dress luxuriously, staff ignoring people, and now, when I come back, the same security guard is about to throw me out again. Robert tried to remain calm. We have orders to maintain the security standards, sir. We're always on the lookout for anyone who might cause a ruckus. Denzel nodded, smiling wryly. I see. So, for you, plain clothes equals criminal potential, correct? No one answered. James opened his mouth to say something, but chose to remain silent. Staff from nearby stores looked on, curious, while Robert tried to keep his posture, but his hands were shaking. I'd like to speak to the person in charge of the mall, the highest level. Now, said Denzel, crossing his arms. Robert snorted. That would be Mr. Lancaster, the director of operations, but he's not available. At the moment, Denzel kept his gaze steady. Then call whoever's in charge. If you can't find him, you can call the local press. I'm sure they'll want to hear about how ordinary customers are treated here. The threat of media exposure made Robert look even paler. Please, Mr. Washington, accompany me to the management room. I'll see what I can do. They walked down the corridor, closely followed by James Wilkins, whose face was on fire, embarrassed and at the same time worried about his own job. Denzel noticed every employee's face that crossed his path. Some were panicked, others relieved. It seemed that, at last, someone important was willing to confront Brightwood Galleria's harmful practices. When they arrived at the main office, a large glass-walled space that overlooked the entire central atrium of the mall, Denzel was invited to sit in the leather chair in front of a large, dark wood desk. Robert rushed to make calls, desperately, trying to locate Mr. Lancaster. Meanwhile, James remained standing, gloomy. Shall I step down, sir? Asked the security guard, almost in a whisper. Denzel shook his head. No, stay. I want you to hear everything. It's important. A few minutes later, a woman dressed in a light grey suit appeared at the door. She had an austere expression, but she couldn't hide her nervousness at seeing Denzel Washington sitting there. Her name was Rebecca Sullivan, and she was the assistant, operations manager at the Galleria. Mr. Washington, good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Sullivan. I've been advised that there's been a problem. There's been more than one problem, Denzel replied. And they didn't start today. It's come to my attention that this mall has been discriminating against people based on appearance and social class. The online reviews are awful, and the experience I've had has only reinforced that. Rebecca swallowed. Mr. Washington, what I can tell you is that the Galleria has a sophisticated target audience, which pays a lot for products and expects a proper environment. And people who dress simply aren't welcome. Denzel narrowed his eyes. That's not it. We just maintain a stricter security policy to prevent theft and preserve the well-being of our best customers, she tried to explain, but it sounded like a ready-made excuse. Denzel slapped the table, annoyed, although his voice remained controlled. This policy creates a hostile environment. Yesterday I saw employees ignoring a lady. I saw salespeople who only pay attention to those who seem to have money. That's the opposite of well-being, Mrs. Sullivan. She looked away. At that moment, Robert Harris returned, flustered. I spoke to Mr. Lancaster, but he won't be here until later. He asked you to conduct the explanations. Rebecca nodded. Then she tried a more polite approach. We can offer you a personalized tour, Mr. Washington. Explain in detail how the Galleria operates. I'm sure you'll change your mind about our practices. I don't need a tour, Denzel retorted firmly. I need action. I need to know if you understand how wrong it is to approach simple people as if they were criminals or intruders. Rebecca took a deep breath. Since Lancaster isn't here, I can try to resolve the situation immediately. I propose a meeting with all the supervisors and store managers to discuss changes in conduct. Denzel nodded slowly. looking at her appraisingly. Good start, but I want to see it happening now, not in a report next month. James Wilkins, who until then had stood quietly in a corner, stepped forward. Mr. Washington, if I may, I'm really sorry for what I did. I was hired and trained to act like that, to evaluate appearances, to be suspicious of people who didn't look standard. I didn't realize I was making such a mistake. Denzel stared at him, measuring his every word. I appreciate the apology, James, and I hope you understand for yourself how it affects people. James bowed his head, holding back his shame. I do, sir. At the same moment, Rebecca made a few phone calls. In less than half an hour, the meeting room next door was packed with managers and supervisors, each looking worried or annoyed. Some whispered that the movie star was making a scandal. Others were genuinely afraid of losing their jobs. When everyone had settled down, Rebecca introduced Denzel. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mr. Denzel Washington, a very special guest. We've had some unfortunate incidents involving Galleria service and security. Mr. Washington has raised some points that, honestly, we should consider urgently. Denzel stood up and faced the audience. It was nothing new for him to speak in public, but the atmosphere there was different from a usual speech. There was resistance, mistrust, crystallized prejudice. He began in a calm voice. Yesterday, nobody recognized me. I came in here dressed as an ordinary citizen and was treated as if I were trespassing. I saw employees ignoring humbler customers. I saw looks of contempt, and I clearly witnessed two modes of service, one for value customers, the other for non-standard people, and that saddens me deeply. Some supervisors fidgeted in their chairs, embarrassed. A man called Bradley Palmer, in charge of several menswear stores in the mall, tried to defend himself. Mr. Washington, I don't deny that some screening is necessary. We invest a lot in security, and unfortunately, statistics show that thefts are committed. Denzel interrupted him. By people of all classes and appearances, don't they? Bandits don't have a fixed profile. Selective distrust only breeds prejudice. Bradley fell silent, realizing he didn't have a coherent answer. Denzel resumed. I understand that you want to protect property, but there are limits. Nobody wants to go into a place and be treated as inferior. A woman, Linda Robertson, a jewelry store manager, raised her hand. Mr. Washington, I agree that there are problems. I myself have felt uncomfortable when I've been told to prioritize customers who appear to have more purchasing power. I even argued with my boss, but they said I should follow the manual. She looked at Rebecca, visibly tense. Forgive me, Mrs. Sullivan, but it's the truth. We can't just ignore the guidelines. Rebecca snorted, glancing at Denzel. Well, we have to admit that some of the guidelines came from Mr. Lancaster. He always insisted on this kind of stance, so as not to scare off our big buyers. Are your big buyers afraid of sharing space with simple people? Asked Denzel, looking at everyone. Don't you think that people with higher incomes also feel uncomfortable when they witness gross discrimination? There was an embarrassed silence. Some nodded in agreement. Others didn't seem to know how to respond. Then Denzel continued, his voice firm. Let's make something clear. Either you change these guidelines, or I will take this story to the media. And know that I have the strength to make this mall an example of what not to do. The air became heavy. Rebecca finally stood up. Mr. Washington, I understand your indignation, but I'm asking you for a vote of confidence. Let's make a change. Let's do, here and now, an immediate review of procedures. We cancel any orientation that involves discrimination based on appearance or social class. Denzel crossed his arms. I want something in writing, a public commitment, and I want every employee trained to treat everyone with respect. As Rebecca nodded, a commotion broke out. Mr. Lancaster himself had arrived. He was walking fast, his face red with anger. What's all this? Denzel Washington, I demand an explanation. He had a burly build and an impeccable suit. He looked angrily at Rebecca and Robert. "Why did you call me in such a hurry? I was in an important meeting with investors." Denzel stared at him without showing any fear. "Investors who would know the kind of treatment you get here." Lancaster laughed, but without humor. "Treatment? I'll tell you what the treatment is. We offer exclusivity, comfort, and security to those who spend real money. And if someone dressed like a beggar shows up, we obviously check it out." The room fell silent, everyone shocked by the audacity. Denzel kept his voice controlled but full of indignation. "Do you know who also spent real money before they became famous? Ordinary people, like me. And you have no right to treat anyone like dirt." Lancaster clenched his fists on the table. "I don't have to listen to moralizing. You may be famous, but you don't run this place." Rebecca Sullivan sniffed sharply. "Mr. Lancaster, Mr. Washington is trying to help. The Galleria is suffering more and more criticism. The reviews are terrible." He interrupted her, shouting, "Don't give me reviews. I managed to keep the right public coming here. If they don't like it, they can find somewhere else to spend their money. I work with people who have real money." Denzel stood up and approached him, remaining calm even in the face of so many insults. "And I, Mr. Lancaster, am one of the majority shareholders in this enterprise. I've put real money here. I can ask for the documentation that proves my financial participation. Do you think I'll keep investing if you carry on like this?" Lancaster's face paled. For a moment, he stammered, not knowing how to react. Then, he slumped his shoulders, trying to maintain his pose. "This is ridiculous. You may have joined as a partner investor, but you don't know anything about the day-to-day operation. That's why they hired me." Denzel held out his hand. "Then show me the reports, and be aware that if it's proven that you're fostering discriminatory practices, I'll demand your immediate dismissal." Lancaster's expression was one of pure fury. He glared murderously at Rebecca, who seemed ready to confirm everything Denzel had said. Then, seeing himself cornered, Lancaster muttered something inaudible. He turned around and left the room, slamming the door. "What does that mean?" asked Robert Harris, visibly startled. Rebecca took an exhausted breath. "It means we'll have to review everything, from security to sales training, at the risk of Brightwood Galleria losing not only funding, but also credibility." Denzel turned to the audience of managers. "No pressure, but this needs to be done now, because I won't allow my name and my investment to be associated with a place that humiliates people." And so began the emergency meeting, which went on for hours. Denzel demanded that each manager report on the day-to-day practices in their stores. Some admitted, embarrassed, that they avoided greeting customers they thought were not fit to buy. Others confessed that they didn't like it, but felt obliged to follow instructions. Finally, a new internal code of conduct was drawn up, in which all customers would be served without discrimination. The security team was instructed to approach only those who showed suspicious or violent behavior, and not those who appeared to have less money. At the end of the meeting, Denzel was visibly tired, but relieved. He had taken the first step towards changing the culture of the Brightwood Galleria. Seeing James Wilkins' expression, who looked even more dejected, he approached him. "Listen, James, I didn't come here to ruin your livelihood," said Denzel, putting his hand on his shoulder. "I just want you to understand that you can't judge people by the clothes they wear." James nodded, his eyes moist. "Thank you, Mr. Washington. I'd never thought about that, you know. You follow orders, but you forget that each person has a story. I'll try to do better." Denzel smiled slightly. "That's all I ask." Over the next few weeks, the Brightwood Galleria underwent a remarkable transformation. The first few days were turbulent. Many old customers complained because they were used to the exclusive treatment and didn't want to share spaces with those they considered inferior. Some old employees couldn't adapt to the new rules and resigned. Gradually, however, another public began to frequent the mall. Families from the neighborhood who had previously felt intimidated now came in, strolled around and consumed. A gray-haired man who played the violin on the subway was invited to perform at events promoted by the Galleria in an attempt to bring art and inclusion closer together. James Wilkins stayed in his job, but underwent intense public service training, He was seen helping people find stores, giving information with a smile on his face. His suspicious look had been replaced by a helpful one, and he himself admitted that he felt better that way. Rebecca Sullivan temporarily took over as Director of Operations, while Lancaster's case was examined by the administrative advisors. Evidence emerged that he had indeed implemented those discriminatory guidelines. Fearing a bigger scandal, Lancaster resigned even before he was officially removed. And Denzel Washington? He made more visits to the Brightwood Galleria, always discreetly, often unannounced. He chatted with the staff, drank coffee at morning light coffee, watched the flow of people. He noticed that more and more simple customers were being greeted warmly. One Saturday, he was approached by Olivia Turner, a shoe store manager, who thanked him for the change. "I'd been working here for over a year, Mr. Washington. I saw so much injustice that I began to think it was normal. But after that meeting, I felt I had permission to treat everyone with dignity. Now my sales team even performs better because we're no longer judging anyone by their pocket." Denzel smiled. "I'm glad, Olivia. That's how everyone should be treated." He knew he hadn't solved all the world's problems, but at least he had set an example that it was possible to reverse a toxic culture when you had the courage to stand up to the top of the pyramid. Sometimes big changes start with small steps, or a monumental scare to those in charge. At the end of December, the Brightwood Galleria was decorated for Christmas. Lighted trees and garlands adorned the corridors. The festive atmosphere seemed to match the new spirit that had taken hold there. Denzel paid one last visit that year, walking leisurely through the corridors. From a distance, he saw James Wilkins helping a lady carry bags. He saw Rebecca Sullivan chatting to customers at the mall entrance. And above all, he saw a variety of faces, of all ages, styles and financial conditions, circulating freely. She stopped in front of a window, displaying a sign. "Everyone is welcome here." He smiled, remembering how much that phrase contrasted with the reality of a few weeks ago. Then he took a deep breath, grateful that he had made the decision to intervene. As he left the Galleria, a few onlookers recognized him. A group of tourists asked for autographs and took photos. He obliged one by one. As he walked away towards his car, he felt a sense of mission accomplished in his chest. He was fully aware that the change would not be instantaneous or definitive without accompaniment. But now, there was a different structure. More vigilant managers, employees, more aware of their role. Above all, there was hope for a better future for everyone. Because that was the big lesson. You don't judge anyone by their appearance. You don't choose who deserves respect based on money or designer clothes. We are all people with stories, dreams, and struggles. And when you combine courage and empathy, you can break down even the highest walls of prejudice, whether they are erected in luxury shopping malls or in the hearts of those who think they can decide who is worth more or less.